to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, our focus will be on initiative versus material. Let's get started with the game that was played by Grandmaster Perelstein against his opponent Alan Stein. Started out d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3. All these are standard opening moves, and black responded with the bishop b4 move, which is the beginning of the Nimzo-Indian defense. Obviously, the bishop creates a pin over the knight, and one of its main ideas is to prevent white, at least immediately, to play e4, because that could be simply captured by black's knight. So in this position, after bishop b4, the other idea that black has to oftentimes trade the bishop for the knight on c3 and create double pawns. Although it's not such an obvious gain at all, because the cost would be to give up the pair of bishops and therefore weaken the dark squares on black's side. Here white has many ways to continue, some of the most popular ones being playing either queen c2, which prevents the doubling of the pawns. Of course, it makes an early queen move, which is usually not recommended, but in this case queen c2 is definitely a healthy and well-playable move. Another very common move would be to play e3. Of course, there are numerous others. In this game, white played g3, fianchettoing the bishop on the king side. Of course, giving black the option, if they choose to trade on c3. In this particular game, black played differently, namely playing c5, a very common strategy in this opening for black. Now what black is looking to do is to trade on d4, the pawns, and if and when the white queen would recapture with the queen, then the black knight immediately would come out from b8 to c6 to attack white's queen. That is why white needs to do something about it, preventing the need of the queen to recapture on d4. White played a very natural move to develop with the knight by playing knight to f3, so now if black would trade on d4, the knight would be the one to recapture. But black now started to play very ambitiously and, of course, somewhat risky, as we shall see. Black continued by playing knight e4, trying to focus on using the pin that was earlier created by the bishop on b4. Now white has several options, but all of them would need to revolve around protecting the knight on c3, as right now black has a double attack on it by the knight and the bishop. In other words, if it would be black's turn again, or white would make a simple developing move such as bishop to g2, that would be a major mistake, because not only that white would lose the pawn after the trade on c3, but it would immediately create a fork, giving a check and attacking the rook in the corner simultaneously. So therefore, this is something certainly not to allow on the white side. The most natural looking move would be to move the bishop to d2, which is certainly a playable move, although then black would have a reasonable game after trading on c3 with the bishop first, and forcing white to have doubled pawns. But white has a better move. Remember one thing that's rather important in chess. We have the regular opening principles or principles of strategy. However, if your opponent breaks one of the rules, oftentimes it allows you to do the same. In fact, sometimes that's the only way to correctly answer their unusual way of playing. Like for example here, black made two moves with the same knight at the very early stage of the game, moving the knight first to f6 and then to e4, and that breaks the rule of don't move the same piece more than once early in the game unless you have to by, for example, recapturing something. In this case, black started a very early attack that's not usual, and that allows white to break one of the other opening principles, namely that do not move your queen early in the game. So in this case, because black made something out of norm, white can, and in fact should, as well. The best response right now is to move the queen to d3. Not only that this move protects the knight on c3, but also immediately attacks the black knight on e4. And black went all out, played rather aggressively, also bringing the queen out early, pushing the issue on that knight on c3. Obviously, black now again threatens to capture on c3, first with the knight and then with the bishop. Black is hoping that white would play bishop d2, but in that case black would succeed on one hand to trade the knight for the bishop first, and then also to trade on c3 the bishop for the knight, forcing white to recapture back with the pawn and have doubled pawns, without having the advantage of the pair of bishops. So now the game becomes very interesting. White captured the knight with the queen. Black, of course, captures also the knight with the bishop, checking white's king. And now the whole point is that white is not able to capture the bishop without loss of material, because then the black queen would recapture and again create a fork and winning white's rook in the corner after the check. Fortunately for white, there is a good move that avoids all of that, and that is to block the check with the bishop. Now that bishop is in a pin and therefore is unable to capture the pawn on b2, because that would cause to lose the queen. So black's only reasonable move really is to trade the bishops on d2, and now the white knight captures back. So this first round of excitement and action has kind of cleared out. Some pieces have been traded off. There is still material balance. What else do we see? We see that the white knight on d2 is pinned. We see that white still is not ready to castle. And we also can see that the queens are kind of out early. It's a little bit of an unusual situation, the queens being out both so early. We can also see that black is somewhat behind in development on the queen side. In fact, all of their pieces, the rook, the knight, and the bishop, are still sleeping there. On the other hand, white has some space advantage, having two pawns already on the fourth rank. Well, let's see how the game develops further. Black continued by playing knight c6, a good developing move, which immediately attacks the pawn on d4 a second time. If right now white would to trade the pawns on c5, the black queen is right there ready to recapture, and black would have a certainly reasonable position. But white played more ambitiously than that, playing d5, immediately attacking black's just developed knight. Of course, black cannot make a trade now on d5 because of the pin on the pawn on e6, but black's plan was not that in any case. It was to jump in to d4. Now a position like that for a knight is always very delicate when it can be easily chased by a pawn by playing e3. However, in this case, black has based on specific tactical justification, not minding that. For example, if white here would play e3, attacking the knight, chasing it right away, black would have two different tactical ways to react. One would be to immediately play knight b3, using both pins at the same time. Obviously, the white knight is in an absolute pin, therefore cannot capture the knight, and white's pawn on a2 is in a relative pin, which means that if the pawn would choose to capture the knight, white would lose the rook in the corner. So therefore, neither of those choices really are at white's disposal. On the other hand, if white reacts to the threats, which is obviously to checkmate by capturing the knight, as well as attacking the rook in the corner, so if white would play rook to d1, protecting the knight, then black could capture a pawn on a2. The other alternative that black would have if we move back to this position after white would play e3 is also interesting. That could be black playing f5, attacking white's queen. Now the white queen has to be very careful where to go, because there are a lot of different threats. For example, if the queen would go to e5, that would be a horrendous mistake, allowing the fork with knight to f3, again using the pin, and winning the white queen. Also, the queen has to be careful to make sure it controls the c2 square, because there is another fork in the air over there. So the only move where the queen can go without immediate loss of material is to return to d3, hanging on to the c2 square and protecting the knight a second time. Black now will play check on f3, even though it's not a fork this time, but still it will strip the white king from the right of castling. Once the king moves out, the knight can simply return to e5, and black has again a reasonable position in view of the fact that the white king can never ever castle in this game. Okay, so let's move on and see how the game Let's go back and see how the game developed instead. White obviously saw what would happen after the immediate e3 move, and therefore rather continued developing by playing bishop to g2. If right now black would respond with a natural, simple castling move, then white would answer that by playing queen to d3 back, which is an important move because it protects the knight and therefore in the future releases the white king from doing that and getting ready to castle. Also, it prevents the idea we already saw at an earlier variation of the black knight moving to b3. But in our game that we're examining, black played more ambitiously, as we saw already from early on, but continues in that style, and black went on to win a pawn by playing knight b3. As we said, this move is using 2 pins. However, black starts going on a very dangerous endeavor, in that going for pawn hunting. That's a very common mistake in openings, that one side, usually black, would go on and try to grab material, a pawn or two, while neglecting his own king or the development of the pieces. In this case, let's see how it continues. White has to play rook d1, getting the rook away from danger as well as protecting the knight on d2 at the same time. Of course, this sacrifices the pawn on a2, and white doesn't seem to care, simply castles, completes development with that, and black went on and grabbed a second pawn. So black is up 2 pawns, however, the king is not yet castled, and the black rook in the corner on a8, as well as the bishop on c8, still undeveloped, and would take still a number of moves to get them into the game. Let's see how the game continues. White traded, and of course black captures back, and white starts opening files and diagonals by trading on e6. This is a critical moment in the game when black could capture back with either pawn. In the game, black chose to capture with the f-pawn. Before we continue with the actual game, let's examine for a moment some possibilities what may have happened if black would have chosen to capture with the other pawn. We can see how now all of a sudden the d file is wide open. White has a beautiful control of the long diagonal with the white bishop on g2, and in fact the white queen in front of it also pressuring that diagonal. And in addition, white has an immediate tactical move to gain some of the sacrificed material back. However, that's not necessarily the most important part about it. White would play queen e5, which immediately attacks the pawn on g7, which would be a very painful pawn to give up, as not only it would be a pawn, but it would take away from black the opportunity of safely castling to the king side of the board. Black defended the pawn by castling, and then white would capture on c5. So now black is up only one single pawn, and as we can see, black has serious difficulties in getting that bishop into the game. Now let's see what happens if black would like to take advantage of their strong point in that they are a pawn up. Moreover, that pawn would be a passed pawn. So let's see what happens if the black pawn on the a file starts running. And now we shall see why it's such a big problem that black is undeveloped. White would now play queen c7. As we can see, the black bishop still cannot develop, and therefore that problem causes a second problem, namely that the two rooks on the black side are not connected. But okay, black keeps pushing the pawn. And now comes the problem. The white rook moves down to d8, with the threat of immediately checkmating in two moves. For example, if black would continue by pushing the pawn, white would immediately just trade and give a back rank checkmate. So black needs to wake up and make a defensive move after white plays rook d8. By opening up, avoiding the back rank checkmate, playing g6. But now white's attack would become real strong, doubling the rooks on the d file. And for example, if now black continues with pushing the pawn, the most efficient way to win is to play queen e7, forcing the issue of the trade of the rooks by threatening to capture it on f8. Rook captures d8, and now the second rook also comes in with a check. Now the poor black king is in major trouble. Needs to start running away from the checks, but cannot hide forever. Just keep chasing it. Queen h8, king e7, rook e8, king d7, and queen f8. Now white threatens to checkmate on the next move with queen e7, and if black plays queen d1, then just hides, blocks the check with bishop f1. If the queen would now go to d6, the queen would be lost immediately, and checkmate would follow on the next move after rook d8. On the other hand, if the king runs to c7, then white plays queen c5, and again checkmate arrives real quick after queen c7. Okay, let's go back to the actual game and see how that continued after black captured back with the other pawn, trying to keep the d file semi-closed and capturing with the f pawn. Now white has several tempting ways to play. One was of course the way they did in the game. The other one would be to play queen to f4 and preventing black from castling for the time being. And in fact, if for example black would continue with a5, the idea would be to quickly gain a tempo, play rook d3 and then get the rook to f3. An interesting idea as well. It's not that there was something really wrong with what white did. White continued similarly as we saw in the last variation by playing queen e5, creating a double attack on two of black's pawns. black again gave up rather the c5 pawn, and now the c5 pawn was lost. So black is still a pawn up. However, there are serious difficulties still in developing the queen side. Black played queen b6 in hopes to exchange queens. As we know, when queens are off the board, attacks lose a lot of their strength, and even the fact that one side would be less developed is not as important as when there are still queens on the board. And that naturally explains white's refusal to exchange queens. Queen h5. The queen is going to the other side of the board, where the black king is somewhat lonely with not enough pieces developing it. And black started to push the pawn, and now the attack starts. Bishop e4, immediately threatening to capture on h7, which would follow with a few move checkmate. Playing g6 would look terrible because it would allow immediately the destroying of the defensive pawn structure in front of the black king. Now we can see the black king is all naked there, and as typical, the rook would come into the attack, threatening to checkmate on the h-file, and this elegant move is possible due to the pin along the 6th rank. So let's go back and see how the game continued after white played bishop e4, when black responded by rather pushing the other pawn. This wasn't much better either, because now the white squares got weakened and the queen got to go to g6 and then starts chasing black's king. a4, queen h7. The king, when it needs to go on a walk towards the middle of the board, almost always ends up in trouble. Bishop g6, king f6, trying to hang on to the g7 pawn, and now, very importantly, it's time to bring another attacking piece to the game, and that's the rook from d3. Now black's position objectively is completely lost, but let's see how the game ended. Queen b2, in hopes to protect that pawn on g7, so after check, the king can stay relatively hiding behind the middle pawns. And now black's queen protects on g7. However, the troubles are not over yet at all. White traded, and now a very fine, quiet move by playing c5, and that move is important in preventing later on of the black king's escape. King queen d4, check, and the chase starts all over again. Check again, king f6, and now white has already numerous ways to win. White could check immediately on f7, although white chose a different route that also works just as well. e3, queen g4, check. Now black's king indeed is right in the middle of the board. f3, queen c4, and now one last quiet move, making sure the black king doesn't run away. Rook d1, and black is pretty much helpless against the upcoming checkmate. Checkmate with a pawn right in the middle of the board. A very elegant and nice game that demonstrates why it's so important to develop your pieces. And now finally, let's see the jewel of the week. It's kind of interesting that we just saw a game that ended with a king being in the middle of the board, and now we'll see a somewhat similar problem, even though this example is from the endgame. In this position, black is up 3 pawns. But sometimes more is less. I think black would wish they didn't have some of their pawns in order to avoid other trouble that faces them. As usual, I suggest to take a couple minutes or more and try to figure out what is the way to win the game here for white. And now, here is the answer on how white should win. Surprisingly, the solution is a quiet move, and that move is to play queen to e1. Now white threatens with an elegant epaulette type of mate with queen g3. Running with the king to f3 wouldn't help because of another fancy mate with queen f1. And lastly, if the king tries to run to e5, there is a new problem, namely the fact that the black queen is on an unprotected square and white would be able to play d4, check, and it's a discovery at the same time, winning black's queen on the next move. A very beautiful endgame. Of course, this is only the end of the solution of the endgame composed by Kubo. Hope you enjoyed this lesson and be back next week for some more chess knowledge. Bye-bye.